Well testing has been around for a very long time. Mr. Horner was one of the pioneers of it. Did some real breakthrough work in trying to, in realizing that pressures in the reservoir can tell you a whole lot about the reservoir. But there's a lot of corrections that need to be made to the data that makes it not very user-friendly. I would think that it's a fair statement to say that most petroleum engineers don't really have a good understanding of well testing. I'm sure there are those that will argue with me on that, but it's just, if you don't do it on a daily basis, it's really hard to stay current with it. As we've demonstrated earlier in Paul's speech, when we're talking about the Horner plot's something that can be done manually on pencil and paper without a whole lot of trouble, but it'd take you a day to put a good Horner plot together. The problem is the Horner, as we discussed, is not applicable in most cases. And so because of that, real well test interpretation hasn't become practical until the advent of personal computers give you just a lot more computing power. Is it black magic? Well, yes and no. There's definitely a lot of art and science involved in it. I'd say it's no worse than seismic as far as that goes. Okay, what we're going to talk about today, I figured y'all see a lot of familiar faces here. Figured you've heard me speak before, and Paul's given a pretty good presentation on the practical aspects. So I thought it'd be good to talk about some of the impractical aspects, like finite difference solutions, simultaneous differential equations. After we finish that, that'll kind of lead us, get a nice segue into super equivalent time, pseudo steady state, pseudo time, pseudo pressure, phase segregation. Dimensionless time and pressure is always a good topic. And then we can talk about the pros and cons of superposition. It's really an important concept, as I'm sure y'all know. Like I say, I figure that'd be good, especially for after lunch. However, if we can take a vote on this, I have an alternate agenda planned as well, where we can talk about why you use a well test, the different types of well tests that are there, how to design, how to interpret a well test. Anybody have a preference? You like this one better? All right. Well, it's a fascinating topic. It will just keep you on the edge of the seat. Okay, we've had a vote. We're going to go with the alternate agenda instead. Why a well test? I get this pretty often. Can it help me? How's it performed? How's it interpreted? How much does it cost? And a lot of it really comes down to that last bullet point there. How much does it cost? We'll talk a little bit about that. It's a pretty expensive process because there's a lot of different costs involved in it. It's not just renting the tools. So with this in mind, what is a well test? All right. One of the most important things that we can get from any well test is an initial pressure. If you don't have an initial reservoir pressure, everything else involved in the reservoir analysis is subject. And we'll see some examples early on as to why, later on as to why that's the case, but you've got to have a baseline. You can get your porosity and your water saturation from logs and get a baseline there, but if you don't have a baseline for your initial pressure, you don't know how much drainage has occurred in it. It can throw off a lot of your other parameters, gas oil ratios, just everything. Okay, now the initial pressure is going to differ from the current reservoir pressure. The initial pressure, for instance, if you're looking at a DST that you run a 2 or 3 minute initial flow period and it builds up and is right there, that's your initial. That actually is not even your initial, because you've actually taken fluid out of the reservoir. Now, from a practical standpoint, that is going to be your initial. But certainly later on in the test, like that test that Paul showed us where we actually saw depletion, you can see very clearly the difference between your initial pressure and your current pressure. Just the DST depleted that reservoir about 400 pounds. Both of those are important. You can get your absolute open flow from a test. The way that the state makes you do that is pretty corrupted, not of much use, but you can actually get useful information of it out of the flow test for sizing your pipe, sizing your surface equipment, that sort of thing. You can get for gas wells, you can get your deliverability against various line pressures to determine if compression will really do you some good on your flow rates. The formation flow capacity is actually something that's measured. It's a combination of permeability and height. You don't actually measure permeability in a test. You measure this product here. The presence of damage or stimulation. This is real handy. As I look at a test, especially DST, I'm able to tell the client, you know, hey, you've got a big skin number here that you should have recovered a whole lot more fluid than you would have. You know, if there wasn't any skin, so I can remove that skin during the analysis and tell them what they ought to expect from the well when they get it completed. If they don't get that when it's completed, that means there's probably some additional skin damage that wasn't remediated during their completion. And last but not least is reservoir boundaries. I would say that in well excess of 99% of the DSTs, you don't see reservoir boundaries. In the longer term tests, you may or may not. All right, keep going here. You can determine stabilized flow at certain flow conditions, or again, that kind of gets back to your AOF and deliverability. You can determine the effectiveness of your stimulation. For instance, if you know that you drilled a Mississippi chert well and it's got a skin number of 20, which believe it or not is actually fairly common, and you go to your completion, you know, I can tell you what sort of rate you should get without any skin damage to it. So when you complete it, you say, hey, we don't have that rate. I'll say, well, you need to go ahead and stimulate it. So it gives you kind of before and after number. Helps you optimize your field development. One of my pet peeves about Kansas is there's probably been about 10 times more wells drilled here than really need to be drilled here. Over drilling is very common. And so with a proper well test, especially in a gas well, you can really determine how to optimize the drilling density. Oil fields as well. Gathering line size, we talked about that. And that kind of goes along with the next one, which is compressor size. You may have a test that was 20 million a day on your DST, but unless you've really analyzed that and run a good long-term well test, you're not going to know how long it's going to produce at that rate. And so if you don't know how long it's going to produce at that rate, it's really almost impossible to optimize your line sizes, your separator sizes, your compressors, all that sort of thing. You really want to know what it's going to do for an extended period. And something near and dear to all of our hearts, the well test is going to help you figure out what the present value of the property is. I think that's what pays the bills.
Can you think of it to explain skin damage?
Yeah, the technical definition is it's a dimensionless number, so it's not PSI, it's not inches, there's no dimensions on it. But what it does is it makes the wellbore act smaller than it actually is. So if you've got a 8-inch hole that's got a big skin damage number on it, mathematically it's making it look like maybe a 2-inch diameter hole. And so your cross-sectional area available to flow, which is, you know, if you unwrap that wellbore, you know, until it forms a rectangle, you know, if it's a 2-inch hole, that rectangle available to flow might only be this big. If it's an 8-inch hole and you unwrap it, it's this big. So the skin damage takes it from this size down to that size.